Hello, everybody. So today we start Unit 5, which is one of the most important, first of all, and one of the coolest units that we do, and it's all about learning and so forth. So we're going to go over an intro and then get into Section 1 today. Even though you read Section 2, we'll get into Section 1, and then you'll be doing some stuff with Section 2 just after this. Okay, so in this particular section, we talk about learning and conditioning, and that is just sort of like the basis of behavioralism in psychology, and it's what we, want to know, like why do people behave the way they do? And there'll be some great applications that we'll have with this. We're going to do a project with this one, which is really cool, where you get to make a brochure about how you would train either a dog if you're a teacher or if you're a coach for a sports team. So that's going to be something that's going to help to solidify the information in this section. So when we talk about learning in this section, we are talking cognitive, and then we'll get into behavioralism because you have B.F. Skinner in this one as well. And that is like why we change our behavior. And we base that on a lot of the fact that there's people's individual experiences, and their environment is going to guide them in certain instances for their, modifying their behavior and almost how they're thinking as well. This has a lot to do with adaptation as well, as we adapt to new environments, and how if we go from, school to home, like how does that change the way we behave and so forth. And we, over time, can change those behaviors and modify them as well. And we develop habits and so forth because we've gotten feedback from our environment and so forth. That's going to develop our emotional reactions and then even our skills and how we learn our skills. So there are 3 types of conditioning. 2 are in the first sections, and then 3 is the third one is in the 3 and 4. So today we're in this segment we're going to talk about classical conditioning specifically, and then we'll talk about operant. So classical conditioning is really all about the fact that there is a reflexive, involuntary response, and there's some kind of stimulus that's triggering that. And usually that stimulus, if it's being conditioned, is not something that would naturally have somebody be stimulated by that and have that same response. So you're getting something that would naturally not cause a response, and you're conditioning it to create a response. This is an example of this is in your textbook, is Irv's reaction to the attic. Now, some of us may be scared of going to the attic, but for Irv, he was not scared of going into the attic and didn't have that association of fear with the attic until he got locked in the attic, and now any of that creates that anxiety because he was trapped. Operant conditioning is the second type, and that's all about consequences. It's all about reinforcement and punishment, and it's one of the most important sections as well as classical to really grasp, and some of the content in both these sections is very difficult at times. And so we're going to make sure that we review that quite a bit. Okay, so this is about voluntary behaviors that we are guided, and we actually, it's not a reflexive, it's not something that just happens and we don't know or happening. We're making a conscious decision to do something because of consequences, and we'll talk about, why consequences and positive and negative is going to be something that we're going to have to retrain our brain in psych to think about them in different ways because they don't mean the same thing. But all this is shaped by those consequences that can either be reinforcers or punishments. And then last thing you'll learn at the end of the chapter is observable learning. And this is really easy as to sort of grasp why we imitate people and what that does to our behavior. When we observe the actions of others, does it guide what our behavior is going to be? And there's some really interesting stuff we'll do with that as well. Okay, so let's talk about the components of classical conditioning. And the examples that you gave were really fantastic. You reflected really well on like what kinds of things we could, and things in your own life that you could pair together and so forth. A lot of people put things about pets. That's always the thing that we can kind of grasp upon. So with this, the behaviors are being drawn out or elicited and automatically by some kind of stimulus, and it's a reflexive behavior. and so forth, that's being controlled by the nervous system. The new response stimulus is learned, okay? So normally when we talk about, and we see the dog up there, Pavlov's dog with the bell, okay? Normally bells don't create dogs to salivate, but food does. So in that first number one, there's a illicit behavior that's natural, and that's that food creates salivation. The new stimulus response is that we're pairing that and learning that a second association is going to create that, and that's going to be the bell. And so we're pairing a neutral stimulus, the bell, something that wouldn't normally cause somebody to salivate, and then we are pairing that with an unlearned natural stimulus of the food, and then we're putting those together to get that same response. Okay, so we're going to go over these as well. One of the things that you're going to want to do, maybe if you need some extra explanation, I'm going to put some different videos up, and so I'll tell you to pause and you can go out and watch those videos. Some of them are kind of cute, so I'll go over that. The first video is about Ivan Pavlov's, and it's just a girl who's talking about it and sort of going over why these things happen. So you can pause the video now if you want to look at that before we start talking about it. Okay, so in terms of Pavlov, we know that Pavlov, actually he wasn't really looking for this particular response from dogs, but he noticed, as a scientist does, and you need to know his name, okay? And we know as a scientist does that sometimes haphazardly they kind of run into scientific evidence. And he noticed that the dogs were salivating, and because he was walking towards the door, or they could see the bowl. And he thought, oh my gosh, look, that's really not normal for dogs to react that way. Usually you would think that they would react that way to just food or smelling the food, but they're reacting just to my footsteps. So he started to explore this kind of thing, looking at what was producing saliva in the dogs. So he put food in the dog's tongue, and and you can see the experiment there. After several days, the dog salivated and so forth, and whatnot. And as he entered the room with his footsteps, they also did the same thing. So then he realized that that salivation is a reflexive, involuntary, automatic response to food, and the dogs were anticipating that signal and so forth because they were hearing his footsteps. So that's when he started to pair it with things that were also neutral stimulus like the bell. Now, we see this in our own pets, and what I would ask you if we were in class, do you have a sound? Does your pet respond to something other than food, a sound or a sight of something that causes them to go crazy? My cats, they respond to a bag of their treats. Okay, they will also respond to us opening a can opener that's opening the food, the wet food that we might give them. Go ahead and pause and you'll see what happens when we take any cat. Any cat can respond, and they will respond. It's weird. They will respond to a bag of treats even if they're not your cat. And they might respond to even a can opener. I know when we first adopted our cats, the can opener, they went crazy. So it's not even something that's in the environment they're currently in. It could have been something they were conditioned from before they got to your house. So go ahead and pause and you'll see just this one guy standing out in the street and what happens when he holds a treat bag. Okay, so we've seen that before, and we'll talk about like some of the other things with high order conditioning, what happens when it's not just the bag or the can opener. Okay, so when we're looking at Pavlov's example, what's really important is looking at all of the different, and you guys have got to know conditioned stimulus, conditioned response, unconditioned stimulus, and unconditioned response. We're going to go over that several times today. First of all, the neutral stimulus. What is the neutral stimulus? Okay, it's the bell. Okay, in this example, so it's the signal or the stimulus that's not naturally causing the response. Okay, so the bell is, or the sight of Pavlov or his footsteps don't naturally cause a person or a dog to salivate. The conditioned stimulus is then learned. Okay, So that is also the bell. So the bell is also the conditioned stimulus because you are learning that the bell and you're associating and getting that bell to cause that reflex of salivation. So again, the bell and sight of Pavlov are both the neutral stimulus because they started that way. And then once they're paired with the food and salivation is going to be produced by them, they are then the conditioned stimulus. The unlearned natural stimulus, okay, so the unconditioned stimulus, the one that unconditioned means you didn't learn it, okay? So the unconditioned stimulus is the food because food naturally gives people or gets people or animals to salivate. Okay, so the unconditioned or the USC is going to be the food. And then the reflex or the unconditioned response is salivation. Now, what's really important to remember is that the conditioned and the unconditioned response will be exactly the same, okay? The only thing that changes is the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. Those are the things that will change. The responses will be exactly the same because it should create the same response that you're learning, okay? So then if you pair Pavlov and food repeatedly, and sometimes it doesn't take that long, but sometimes it does, depends on what the stimulus is, then the reflex should occur for both. So Pavlov rang the bell and gave food to the dogs, and they learned that association, and they salivated with just the bell ringing and no food, okay? So again, the unconditioned stimulus is the food. The unconditioned response is salivation. The conditioned stimulus is the bell, and the conditioned response is salivation still. Okay, so that's the example there. All right, so if you look at this example here, let me have you think about this for a minute, and you can pause the video if you want to think even more before I give the answer, is what is the conditioned stimulus here? What is being conditioned to cause something to happen? So the first thing you ask is, what is the response? Okay, what is the response and what's going on in the picture? So we see a young kid or a teenager riding by a house on his bike, and then there's a dog barking, and you can see sort of like he's getting a little anxiety. And then the third frame, we see him have anxiety with no dog. Okay, so we know that the response, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are exactly the same, and that's going to be anxiety. Okay, so naturally, anxiety and fear can come from dogs. Like that's something that can happen. Okay, it's not anything else in the a house shouldn't create any kind of fear or anxiety, but dogs can, depending on the person. Sometimes people do not feel that way. But in this case, the dog is jumping up and barking. It's kind of scaring the guy. And so after a while of that happening, every time you went by this house, you could, feel that anxiety towards the dog. Okay. Now, what is the conditioned stimulus? What is being paired with the dog in the third frame that's creating that anxiety? Well, if you said house, the house, then you are correct. So again, the unconditioned stimulus is the dog. The unconditioned response is fear because those things naturally could happen. Then the conditioned stimulus is just the house because it's been paired with the dog. And the conditioned response is still anxiety and fear because now it's been paired with the house and not the dog. Okay? So let's talk about what are factors that we're going to create this conditioned response. First of all, we need frequency. Very few times is one time going to do that. The only exception, or one of the exceptions, I should say, depending on the person, is going to be taste aversion. So we'll talk about that later. But frequency, you want to pair, the stronger the association is going to be the number of times that those two things are paired. The food and the bell or the dog in the house is going to help. The timing is also important of that too. What's the most effective timing between the two that you need to have? Well, the most effective is immediately and before the unconditioned stimulus. So meaning the bell is the conditioned stimulus and you want to have that before the food. So you ring the bell, then you give them the food. The dog barks and you are near the house. that kind of thing that needs to be immediately before. And it also should come a half a second. You need to know that specific time frame, that a half a second is what Pavlov came up with between the two timing. Okay? Don't know why that's repeating, but it is. Hold on. There we go. Okay, and then the next things to think about too with factors that affect response is what are examples of stimulus generalization, stimulus discrimination, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. And normally I would have you guys write this down in groups and so forth, which is why virtual is so hard. So I want you guys to think those are the 4 next things that you need to know, those 4 particular definitions. So with stimulus generalization, okay, and I gave you an example there, it's a condition response can occur also when something is similar to the original response. So let's take my cats, for example. So my cats, and this happens, and you probably have seen this with your own pets, cats get excited with the treat bag, but anytime, if we don't have treats and we're trying to find them in the house, even a chip bag, anything that makes the similar sound, a nut bag, anything that makes that similar sound, is going to cause them to come running thinking they're getting a treat. So that is similar to the original conditioned stimulus, and it's happening without pairing them. It's just that it's similar to that first stimulus. Now, stimulus discrimination is what happens if you use a box. So the same thing is not going to happen if I use a box of cereal, okay? They're only going to get excited for something that's very similar. So conditioned response made to one stimulus and not another. So another thing was a dog conditioned only with a high-pitched tone is not going to see the same behavior as somebody with a dog with a low-pitched tone. They can tell the difference between the stimuli. And then what's extinction and response recovery? So extinction is that if we don't have that pairing after a while, there's a gradual weakening and apparent disappearance of the conditioned response and so forth because you're not presenting the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus together. One example of this that we'll see in the higher order conditioning is nurses with chemotherapy. So what patients usually go through is they will equate, they get nauseous with chemotherapy. That's something natural, all right? So an unconditioned stimulus is the chemo, and then the unconditioned response is nausea. A nurse can then be paired who's familiar with the patient can cause that sickness to happen just by looking at the nurse because they've been paired with the chemotherapy as a conditioned stimulus. A bell without a food, so nurse without chemo. If the nurse disappears and you get another nurse, then it's going to take a while for you to pair or somebody to pair another nurse with the chemotherapy. So that can have extinction. There can be a weakening of that. It can come back in that spontaneous recovery, the fact that conditioned response can reappear after even a few hours. It can come back even a few days. Extinction is not unlearned or erased, especially when it's something so strong. It's in that long-term memory somewhere, okay? So those are 4 really important vocab words you need to know for classical. Now, one of the videos I'm going to have you stop and look at is to look at what's high order conditioning, okay? Now, the high order conditioning is really easy, okay? So this is the idea that, okay, I've got my cats, and my cats are, I'm opening the drawer where the bag of treats is, and when they hear the bag of treats, they run to the treats and so forth. After a while, and this has happened in the last year or so, we have our cat treats in a specific little drawer, okay? It also has cat toys and things that they like to play with. And what happens is my cat is now going over and hitting the little, I'm going to say it's a lever because it's not, it's a little little rings that you have on a drawer, and they're hitting that, and they know that that sound means either treats or toys. And so they go over there and they hit it, and you see dogs and things do that when they're, scratching at doors and things like that. But they are equating it in a second higher order because the bag has now conditioned them. They hear the drawer opening with that little ring, and then it's equated and paired with the bag, which is now paired with the food, which causes them to run, okay? You'll see this, this with examples of, For instance, when we get their food is in the pantry. Now the bag and hearing the cup going into the food, that once was something, a cup, hitting food isn't supposed to make them come running and be hungry, but they know the food's been paired with the cup and the sound of that, right? But now it's being paired even further with the pantry door opening, and then maybe even further than that with you walking to the door, okay? So all of those things can be classically conditioned as well. So that that second pair, what ends up happening is it becomes the conditioned stimulus becomes an unconditioned stimulus. So I would suggest that you go ahead and stop the video now and look at this tutorial. It's from Fresno State, and she goes over, she's a professor, and she really has a good visual for high order conditioning that you can take a look at. Okay, so let's continue on past Pavlov and see what else is going on in the psychology world after he's done. Pavlov is going to pave the way for our next important researcher, which is John Watson. And John Watson is a behavioralist, and he is going to continue. We're going to see that with B.F. Skinner as well. And what Watson was looking for was he was looking to see if behavior could be learned based on past experiences and environmental influences. And so he looked at infants. He wanted to know innately how could we condition infants who really don't have any basis of something. So it was really interesting. He looked and he said, okay, there's three emotions that innately we are all conditioned or naturally like have a reflex that's not conditioned but is naturally unconditioned and creates a reflex. And so he said infants grow and they immediately have fear, rage, and love. Now you think, okay, why does a baby have rage? Well, they do in a certain sense because when they cry really hard because they want food, they don't know how to control their anger, or them being upset. So I guess that kind of rage is there. The other thing that can be paired, these emotions could be reflexive to a small number of stimuli, okay? So fear of loud noises and also sudden dropping, okay? Now loud noises, if you bang something and a baby's around, they will jump, okay? It's immediate. It's a reflex that they have. The other thing is like, well, how do you see if a baby knows that dropping, okay? So I never dropped my children, but you could hold a baby and then kind of get this kind of motion going down. And what ends up happening is they put their arms out immediately. And so they know that that's a feeling of dropping, and it kind of can startle them and upset them. So those are reflexes that happen, and they can be create the emotions, the three emotions above. So this is not one of our finest moments of the psych world is Little Albert experiment, okay? And this is where Watson and his grad student Rosalie Rayner, they worked to try to condition and create an emotional response with baby Albert. Now, baby Albert was chosen for this experiment because of the type of baby he was. Now, his mother worked in the hospital that Watson and Rayner were doing their work. She was a single mother, and they asked, can we use the baby to do this experiment on? And she was fine with that. The thing that made him really interesting in this experiment is because I don't know if any of you or have seen people, if you put a baby on Santa Claus's lap, some kids are fine with it and some kids like freak out. They don't like the Easter Bunny. They don't like any of that stuff. They get really freaked out with animals even and things like that. Baby Albert was afraid of nothing, okay? And that's one of the things you're going to see in this video I'm going to show you. He was afraid of nothing. You're going to see in this video I'm going to show you that he was very calm and he was a healthy baby and he wasn't afraid of any kind of variety of objects. Any object they put in him, you can see the number 1 there, he's happy with. You're going to see them put a monkey on him, a huge dog, a rabbit. All of those things he just kind of looked at and was curious about. So they knew that those things were not natural things that cause fear in him, okay? They had to have that. That's not going to be for everyone. And so because they had somebody like that, they knew that natural response was not there for him in terms of animals. So go ahead and stop this video and definitely watch this one because it will show you what happened with little Albert, and then we'll go over what you think the responses were. Okay, so as you look at this, you can see the pictures there that were showing the end of the video where we see him crying. So the beginning of the video, they put all these animals on him, he's fine. Then they're going to pair that with the loud noises, and then you can see there as well he is going to be scared of the bunny rabbit now. Okay, so let's go over this and then we'll talk about what happened with this experiment. What was the unconditioned response that they were looking for? The response. That is fear. What was the unconditioned stimulus? One that would naturally cause humans or infants to respond. What's the unconditioned stimulus? The loud noise. Okay, that is for everybody. That infants can vary on if they don't like bunny rabbits or not, but we know that from that fear can be ensued by a loud noise. Okay, then what's the conditioned stimulus that Albert was not naturally afraid of? What was conditioned then? The white rat. Okay, that was the first thing that they were looking for. And then what was the timing of the pairings? Okay, they had 2 pairings in the first session, and a week later they did 5 more pairings. It took 7 pairings, that's it, to create an extreme fear for little Albert for the rest of his life. It's a very sad story. And what's interesting too, let me go back one. Well, I can't, sorry. What's really interesting too is that he really generalized, okay? How was stimulus generalization found in the experiment? Well, we see that. They started with the rat and they were pairing the rat and then anything that was fuzzy, the rabbit, the monkey, and then you see in the video they hold a fur kind of shawl. Didn't like that either. And then you see Watson there with the face mask of Santa Claus. And you put the Santa Claus in because it has like a fuzzy beard. Little Albert was like, I'm done. And so all of those, and it only took that 7 pairings in order to create, is very, very powerful. Now, there was a lot of criticisms with this experiment. Of course, it's very unethical. We would never do that to a child today, okay? And little Albert's fear was not reversed. That was the other thing. Now, that's not necessarily Watson's fault. He didn't allow for the child to not be fearful of animals for the rest of his life. They actually lost track of little Albert. His mom moved away from the hospital. I think she passed away. I have to check that again, but I think so. But they lost track of him, and they couldn't find him. He like kind of disappeared. So they couldn't reverse what they did. And they still don't know exactly who he was. It wasn't his real name because he was adopted, which is why I think his mother passed away and then he was adopted after that. So, yeah, not great and so forth. But it was really powerful, kind of, classical conditioned experiment that showed the power of how we could condition fear responses to these natural kind of neutral objects and so forth. Okay, now Watson, the story doesn't stop for Watson, okay? So Watson, because of this study, lost credibility because it was unethical. I mean, it showed a great response, and the research from it was interesting, but people didn't agree with what he did. He also had an affair with Rayner, his grad student, and he was married, obviously because it's an affair. And so all of that can kind of combined, he was out of the kind of the psych world. But he took what he knew, and what he ended up doing was he worked for advertising, and he got into marketing. And he is the reason why we attach certain things to advertisements, because he started working with that. And he started with toothpaste, I think it was, and like attaching the fact that you're a good mother if you use this type of toothpaste, something that we wouldn't naturally pair with things. So I always show this example. It's a Super Bowl commercial, okay? And we know that a lot of advertisements have a lot of like subliminal type of messages in them, but they also pair things together that we wouldn't naturally do. And sex appeal in advertisements was pioneered by Watson. And so forth, and getting that positive feeling, or even feelings of fear and inadequacy and pairing those emotions with things. So the little snuggle one at the bottom, pairing a cute animal with a product. In turn, you're getting conditioned by using Snuggle fabric softener. You're going to get a warm feeling and feel good about yourself and so forth. So let's take a look at this example that's from the ad here that was from the Super Bowl, and try to think of what is the unconditioned response, the unconditioned unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. So the first thing to ask yourself is what naturally happened? What is the response they're trying to get from this advertisement? They want you to eat a hamburger. Okay, they want you to eat a hamburger. Okay, that's the response. What naturally creates, that? Okay, so we got to think of the burger and buying the burger. The burger usually makes us hungry, and then we're going to go buy the burger, right? Now, what's being paired with that is this attractive girl, and the attractive girl be paired with it and should make somebody maybe be hungry and want to buy a hamburger. We feel good if we eat it, that kind of thing. It's that positive kind of reinforcement. The girl's eating it, and in the commercial, she's walking and she's really like pounding into it, and it's because she's attractive, and you're not going to be unattractive if you eat a hamburger. That could be paired with it too. But certainly an attractive girl doesn't make somebody want to eat, in terms of like being hungry, but a burger would. So they're trying to pair that in the advertisement, okay? So all those things are things that are also classical conditioned. They just are not paired as much. Now, other classical responses that were mentioned is we often have this association. Some of you that have dated people and they had a certain cologne or scent. I know this from my 15-year-old daughter who, a cologne on a scrunchie or perfume on a scrunchie and then the cologne on a sweatshirt, and then you exchange that. I know that happens, and so forth. That was a big thing. And then you can't get that kind of smell. Whenever you smell that smell, you think of that person. So cologne doesn't usually you think of intimacy or dating, but with that specific thing, you would pair it with that. The other interesting thing was the thing they did with coffee. And so they figured out that coffee is a substance, right, that gets in your bloodstream, takes about 20 minutes. But when they did this experiment, they found that it didn't always have to happen. So in the experiment, the neutral stimulus was just the smell, a slight taste, not like ingesting for 20 minutes, and then the sight of coffee. And the unconditioned stimulus was the caffeine that makes you alert. So then the unconditioned response, alertness, and then the conditioned stimulus was the fact that just the smell and sight was then paired with the caffeine of them actually, getting the caffeine and getting alert, and it creates some kind of placebo effect. So it can be very interesting when you're looking at even something like as strong as coffee is, and it's going to take 20 minutes, but that was sort of something new. It didn't have to be something that happened a half a second. And we're going to see some of those changes in evolution and classical conditioning as we get to contemporary views. So like I said before, you need to know Ivan Pavlov and you need to know John Watson. Okay, those are some basic ones that are just clear, and B.F. Skinner as well. But there's some other ones as well. And so what you're going to find going forward is you're going to need to know studies. And you know this from the last chapter that we did. You need to know names of researchers so that you can actually take those on the AP exam. They will ask you specific people. And so it's good to get in the habit of who is it, what did they do, and what was the result or impact of their study. And study, those kinds of things, okay? So here's a couple more as we talk about the contemporary views of classical conditioning. We talk about behavioral perspective, a simple association of a conditioned and unconditioned stimulus, and then also cognitive perspective, the mental processes that go on with when we're learning these behaviors and getting it paired as well. In addition to that, we're going to bring in evolutionary as we look at that perspective. The next researcher to know is Robert Rescorla, and he has that cognitive perspective. And what was really interesting is that he did talk about how organisms, humans and animals, actively process learning behavior. And he thought, okay, classical conditioning, it is a reflex, but there is some information processing that's going on as people are learning things. And the conditioning depends on the information that is provided between the two stimuli. And then for learning, for the organism, the conditioned stimulus needs to be a reliable signal. So we see this when he's doing the rats, and he has group 1 and group 2. And group 1 rats, every time they heard that tone, they got a shock that followed. The second group, it was very inconsistent. It didn't happen every single time. And he said that predicts how somebody's going to behave or an organism is going to behave if they don't think the reliable signal is going to be there. We see that with parenting. If people don't follow through with, I'm going to take your car keys away if you don't do X, Y, Z, and then they inconsistently do that or so forth, it doesn't work as well. It has to be like consistent, reliable sourcing. So both groups of rats, though, they found were actively processing the reliability. The first group was definitely like, oh, I'm not doing this because I know I'm going to get shocked. The second group's like, it's not coming every time. So both groups are actively processing those stimuli. And then the second thing that he came up with in terms of conditioning of how somebody's cognitively or an organism is cognitively looking at conditioning is that it's predictive value. They're predicting the value of the stimulus is not, and it's not just an association. There's not just an association. They're literally thinking, what's the value of this? The dogs knew the bell was a reliable signal for the food, and that had value to it. It was a predictable value for it. So he said that cognitive processes are part of learning the relationships, and that we and organisms use that as cause and effect. So for instance, Pavlov's dogs, the bell predicted that food would come because food consistently was given after the bell signal. Okay, and then for Rascolia's rats, in the second group, the tone was sometimes getting shocked, so there was less fear response because of that unreliable and that predicted value was not as high as the first group. Okay, so those important aspects of that. Now, as we continue with that, we think about the evolutionary aspects of conditioning, and that we look at Darwin's theory of evolution, and that there's patterns of behavior that are shaped by and how we adapt to our environment. And that is true for many species that are conditioned around them. There's a natural fact that species will learn and learn when things are dangerous in their environment and adapt to that. So for instance, animals are going to learn signals that predict that their predators are that may attack them. So the approach of the predator is your unconditioned stimulus with the sounds and smell, which once were neutral. Okay, so maybe the rustling of leaves before would have been a neutral stimulus. It wouldn't have meant that a predator is coming, but now it's paired with a predator. The sound of it now becomes a conditioned stimulus, and that causes them to flee. And this naturally occurs in conditioned, and we have that as an evolution aspect of every organism. Now, classical conditioning was then continued with John Garcia. And we talk about this in class, like what's a time when you experience taste aversion, and we talk about that and so forth. And that's when we're going to get sick and not want to eat something. So my example that I can give you is I ate a salad. This was a few years ago. I ate a salad for dinner one night, one break. It was a spring break. And a few years ago, we were having these stomach bugs like, rampant in the schools. And I couldn't eat salad for weeks after that. And I love salad. It's actually what I had for lunch today. And so the neutral stimulus was a salad. That was, that's not going to cause nausea for me. It might for somebody else, but not for me. And then it was paired with the virus. And then I ended up throwing up. So that was my unconditioned response, or feeling nausea. And then my conditioned response is now still nausea, but it's based on salads, which is now my conditioned stimulus. And so we all have these stories about eating too much stuff. In the example that was earlier, she talked about her sister eating too much ice cream, and now she can't eat chocolate. Those kinds of things. But what ends up being really interesting is that timing and frequency, which are the two components that Ivan Pavlov talked about with classical conditioning, don't apply to taste aversion. We can have one pairing and we're done. Her sister eating all that ice cream, it happened once, and she can't eat chocolate anymore. So how is that possible? So John Garcia worked with rats as well, and he did that because it would be unethical to inject a human being with a solution that would cause some gastrointestinal distress and cause you to throw up or whichever. And we would say that that's probably unethical for rats as well, because they're animals, and so we have some APA regulations on those kinds of things. But what he did in his study, remember, is that he had the rats drink the saccharin water, which is a sugary water, which they love. And then what he did was he injected them with that drug that was going to stimulate some kind of gastrointestinal distress, just like taste aversion would be with us eating and getting me eating a salad and getting a virus. And then the rats refused. They paired the feeling of being sick with the drinking of the water because it was paired there. And people were really taken back by his publishings. They didn't believe it because it was being paired once, or maybe a couple times, very limited, not like Pavlov. And later research showed that even we can have 24 hours between the water and the injection. So the timing that Pavlov came off was sort of extended with some, depending on those. But it has to depend on certain things. Some things, you're not going to be able to pair a bell and nausea. Like, you can't really do that. That's not going to do that. But food is another thing. Okay, and that's why it's kind of looped into the evolutionary part of it, because food is one thing. It's not all stimuli that are going to create this. That's why taste aversion is different. So think about that until I tell you the answer. Why would taste aversion be one pairing? And that's dealing with food. Okay, so let me talk about this and be thinking about that. Not all stimuli can be conditioned the same way. Why is it that it's my salad and not the drink or the dessert I ate, or the kitchen table, or the family I'm sitting with at the table? Why? There's all that stimuli that I'm having. Why is it that it's just the salad? Okay. And then the conditioned stimulus does make a difference. And the unconditioned stimulus doesn't always have to follow it immediately. That's one of the things he found out. It could be 24 hours. Now, the answer to my question is our biological preparedness, all right? We are naturally, our evolution tells us that it's something I ate. That's why I feel nauseous, okay? We initially are going to do that because evolution and our ancestors have told us that we need to be careful what we put in our mouth because it can be dangerous to us. So that's why our evolution is sort of spiraling in. And whenever we feel nauseous, we think, oh, it must be something I ate. It couldn't be some other reason. It's the initial thing we kind of go to. And so that's why the pairing works with just once, because our genes tell us that food has done this to us, and it's easy to pair it with it because we're like, well, I'm not going to eat that salad for a while, or that meat from a certain restaurant, because it could make me sick again and I could get really sick and maybe die. Okay? We are protecting ourselves, and so that taste aversion happens to protect ourselves. Okay? What else can I say? Okay, so yeah, protecting eating food poisoning from a restaurant. You may not go to the restaurant and so forth. And that ability to learn and capacity to learn is important because we have those biological associations that help us to differ between things that are dangerous and not dangerous. I don't pair the kitchen table with it because evolutionary wise, that doesn't make sense. Kitchen tables and blocks of wood don't really cause that issue. Okay. Okay, so some of the important things about taste aversion: it violated behavioral principles that any stimulus could serve as a conditioned stimulus. Not everything can be a conditioned stimulus. It does matter. Shows that nature prepares our members of our society and our species to survive, and that there are exceptions to classical conditioned rules. Okay, and then just to end up here, what gives you the creeps? Phobias, okay? How does evolutionary perspective apply to these pictures and phobias? Okay, so what are some of the studies that they did with these things? Unlike little Albert, who experienced trauma and fear of a specific type of object, phobias can be the result of evolutionary things that are, again, like taste aversions, talking about protecting us and from danger and for survival. Elsa Bregman, she was unable to do some things. So again, extending those things about taste aversion, not every conditioned stimulus is going to be able to create a response. And she tried and she replicated the little Albert experiment, and she did it with little blocks and curtains. And she didn't find any, she could not get it, she could not get it to pair. Well, why is that? Why couldn't she get wooden blocks and curtains to create that fear? Even with a loud noise, she used the loud noise and everything. Well, because our initial, our evolutionary biological predisposition is to not be fearful of blocks and curtains, it's be fearful of animals that could hurt us. That's why it worked with little Albert, because it's animals, and we naturally would be able to be naturally have a predisposition for animals. Okay, Martin Seligman, he said that phobias are definitely selective. We don't have, now there's phobias for like butterflies and things like that, but for most people, you know, we don't have a aversion to stairs. We would have it to snakes, okay? And the reason why those pictures are there is because, you know, those are things that evolutionary wise our ancestors have passed along. It's really weird how that happens, you know, where we just pass along like these are things that we should be wary of because they could hurt us. And they did some studies with monkeys and preschoolers, and the monkeys were definitely able to recognize images of snakes before they recognized and really pointed towards the flowers. So they were really generated towards that. And preschoolers definitely could pick out snakes and spiders, even if they had never had an adverse thing with them, quicker than they did flowers, frogs, and caterpillars. So even frogs and caterpillars could be something that could cause fear, but they definitely went towards the snakes and the spiders, which tell you that they are they have predisposition to those things evolutionary wise. And they associated angry faces with snakes and spiders and not necessarily frogs and caterpillars, okay? So we avoid that so we can survive and pass along our genes and things like that. So those are important aspects of that as well. Okay, as we end this particular module, there is a practice to do with classical conditioning where you fill out a chart and then I have the answers. Please do that and try it out first. Remember the response for conditioned and unconditioned is going to be exactly the same. So put that in first and then see what's causing, you know, the unconditioned response, what's causing it naturally to happen. And then the conditioned stimulus, what is now being paired to create that similar thing. And so you can then look at my answers and see how you did with that and so forth. All right, have a great day, everybody.